Today I'd like to talk about the difference between the way machines see the world, or the way they make images which we look at, and the way we perceive the world ourselves. We walk around in an ocean of imagery these days because we're all carrying these little pocket cameras, these little pocket computers, which have cameras, part of their mechanism, which are able to create photographs, very nice photographs, anytime we want. We create billions and billions of these images every single day because so many people have these cell phone cameras and so many people are taking pictures. But is that the way we really see the world? I mean, the image that they create parallels how we see the world fairly accurately, but does it really show us the way we see the world? Now, here's a picture of a camera. And we can see that a camera, this is maybe a digital camera or a film camera, and we can see that it is very much a machine. And it has mechanical parts. And those mechanical parts work together to create an image which is very much like what we see with our eye, or very much like what we perceive with our mind, but not really completely. There's always something missing from that mechanical image which is different from the way we perceive it as human beings. I mean, we are not robots. Okay, robots see the world very differently than the way we humans do. We don't actually see the world. We perceive it with our minds. And here we can see in this diagram that what we say we quote unquote see, it's actually something that we perceive, something that we experience with our human being, with our human body. And it isn't just what we see or perceive, or not what we see, it's what we perceive, and our perception is based on what we see with our eye and what we feel with our skin and what we hear, what we touch, and the temperature of the air, the wind blowing through our hair, the smells. It's all goes together to create this very human perception. And we as humans, we don't just see the world, the camera just shows us this little rectangle. And, here, let's look at that here. As beautiful as that cloud picture is, it's just a rectangle. And when we are perceiving the world, we're looking at the world and our eyes are moving constantly back and forth and we're moving around. So we experience so much more constantly, and our brain puts it all together into this total perception, this total experience, which we remember. Here's another example of how the camera creates this sort of like parallel universe, this mechanical image, which is contained in this little rectangle, which isolates a certain part of the visual world and records all the details very accurately, but doesn't really completely express the experience that we have of it. And, but we can take that machine and we can use it to create artwork. Here is a photograph by Ansel Adams from 1934 of clouds rising above a lake. Now, this is a work of art. He's not capturing the experience. He's creating work of art. He's creating a photographic work of art. He's taking the camera and projecting an image onto a piece of film, which he then develops, and then creates this image on a sheet of paper, which he then frames and hangs in a gallery. And so that image, that thing, that photographic thing is the art. And it parallels our perceptions in many ways. It captures so much of what we see, but not the totality of what we perceive, because Ansel Adams is trying to express his experience through this photograph. And so the photograph actually probably contains more than what we just see if we were there. Now here's another photograph by Ansel Adams. Again, he's isolating a certain part of the landscape that is expressing how he feels about that landscape. The clouds are very dramatic and they're marching in over that landscape. So, it probably expresses, he probably had to wait forever. In fact, we know that Ansel Adams would stand around waiting for hours for that perfect moment to create that photograph that he hoped would express how he perceives the landscape, how he perceives the interaction of these natural elements in the landscape. So this camera is being used to create sort of this, to stage this photograph, which is very expressive. And so the machine itself is maybe not as truthful as the artist's vision. And so that's why artists create paintings. That's why they create photographs or photographic art, to capture this vision of nature, of the interaction of themselves and the natural world. Now here, this is a painting by Bakhuizen from 1667. He's a Dutch painter, and they didn't have cameras in those days. The only way they could create an image is by painting it or drawing it. And he's probably done a lot of research. He's drawn a lot of clouds, but he had to paint this in the studio. They didn't have tubes of paint so that they could go outside and paint outdoors. They had to do all their paintings in a studio. So he'd have to do his drawings outside, bring them into the studio, along with other things. And here we have this stormy sea off of a rocky coast, and one ship is sinking and another ship is threatened, and the waves are crashing and the clouds are billowing, and it's very stormy. This is a very popular type of painting back then. Artists painted a lot of stormy sea paintings because it was very popular, something that people like to collect. And what's interesting here, though, is that, Bakhuizen probably he's not painting actual rocks, realistic rocks. These are probably rocks that he found in his garden that he brought into the studio and he's using as models in this painting, because even though they're very detailed, they don't look very natural. And we know that other artists of the same period would, like Jacob van Ruysdael, would go out and they'd get branches and sticks and bring them into the studio and use those as models for logs in the foregrounds of their landscapes. Now here, this is one of my paintings. It's called Stormy Weather. And we have a stormy sky, the natural, the force of nature in this stormy weather marching in over this landscape, over the surface of the earth, where we look down and see this suburban neighborhood where everything is very regular, very secure, very geometric. So there's a contrast between the safety, the solidity of that suburban neighborhood and sort of the stormy, organic, flowing nature of the sky as it's piling in over this landscape in a very threatening way. Notice that the people down below, those tiny little people, they're all running for their houses, trying to escape the storm. Now, storms are very beautiful. We love to watch them, but they are very threatening with the wind and the lightning and the thunder. Now, here's a painting by Meindert Habema. This is from 1670, about the same time as that Bakhuizen. And here, Meindert Habema, he's looking at nature and he's capturing it very accurately. Notice how those clouds, they're very detailed, and those trees, they're very leafy. Okay, but they're, for all his accuracy, and I copied one of his paintings, and for all the accuracy and the leafiness of those trees, there's a certain stylized quality to them. All the trees have a certain look, because it's his human perception of the landscape that he's capturing. I mean, he thinks he's being as accurate as possible, but what he's really doing is giving us his experience of nature, his experience of trees, of clouds. And he's using nature as his model. He's using those to help structure his picture, but it's very much his vision of the world. And notice the contrast between the sort of the wildness of the nature and the regularity and the safety and the security of that little house, that little cottage, and the people that are in the landscape. Now, this is one of mine. This is called Stormy Days. And again, a threatening storm bearing down on these bicycle riders, these cyclists riding down that road. And the road represents civilization. And it's very regular. The curve of the road is very geometric. By comparison with the clouds, which are much more organic and flowing, and notice the way the fingers of those clouds kind of reach out over the bicyclists in a threatening way. The cyclists seem to be, scurrying away or riding away from that storm, trying to escape the storm. And so there is the question, will they escape or not? But there is a contrast between the storminess of nature and the cyclists. And it's done from my memory, from my imagination. I'm not looking at the world. I'm not looking at actual clouds, and I'm not looking at actual landscapes. I'm recreating the landscape from my own experience. I'm a cyclist. I'm out there on Sunday mornings, and there have been times when storms do march in and it starts to rain. And so I'm reflecting on that experience, and I'm recreating it from my imagination in the studio. And so this is very much sort of a human reinterpretation in a representational way. There is a sense of realism to it, but it doesn't really try to mimic nature the way a camera can. It doesn't capture the details that a camera can, but then a camera can't capture the fullness of the experience that we have when we're actually out in nature, walking around and looking around and feeling it and seeing it and experiencing it for ourselves. Now this is a painting by John Rogers Cox, and this is from the mid-20th century, and he's painting out in the Midwest. And notice that, he's doing this painting of it's an oil painting, as previous paintings were, of a storm marching in over this wheat field. And this is kind of very much what it's like in the Midwest in the late afternoon when storms come barreling in. But notice that there's a certain regularity to his clouds. They all have a certain similar look, a certain similar shape. So they're not really realistic clouds. They're more surrealistic. They're more dreamlike. And he's capturing the experience, the emotional experience of this moment rather than the photographic accuracy of it. In fact, this painting here was done at about the same time as those Ansel Adams photographs, those black and white photographs that we saw earlier. And so there's quite a bit of difference in sort of the detail. A lot more detail in the Ansel Adams photographs, but there's much more a sense of the actual experience here in this painting. And so in many ways, the painting is able to capture, is more truthful. It's actually more truthful than the photograph. It may be less accurate in terms of detail, but it's more truthful in expressing the experience that we're having as human beings. Now, this is one of mine. This is called Cloud Illusions. And, here the stormy clouds are marching in over the landscape in a very threatening way, and they're reaching their fingers out over that very regular, very geometric landscape down below that we look through the clouds and we see these houses, these very similar, very safe suburban homes, and the streets line up in these almost perfect little rectangles. And, that represents a certain sense of safety and security, civilization versus nature. And here nature is very threatening, and it's kind of bearing down on those people. The people are scurrying, heading for safety. But notice how in this painting, very similar to the John Rogers Cox, that there's a certain similarity, a certain regularity to those clouds. And so I'm creating a very dreamlike, very surreal interpretation of nature rather than trying to give sort of a photographic expression of nature. And so I feel that my painting is actually more truthful than a photograph could be. I'm trying to capture the more fully the human experience, the human perception, rather than sort of a photographic representation of detail. And cameras are really great at capturing detail, but we have a much more complete experience as human beings, and that's what paintings try to capture. Now here, this is a painting, another one of mine. This is called The Bite. And it's a very small painting. It's just about that previous painting. That's kind of big, kind of like about this by, a medium-sized painting. This is very small. This is about 5 by 7 inches, and it's done in egg tempera. It's an ancient medieval medium using an egg yolk as the binder for pigment. And painting it with very tiny brushes. In fact, I have to use a magnifying glass while I'm painting it. And here we have the painting is titled The Bite, and a bite is a shallow bay. Okay, but the painting is also sort of a pun, because if we look down below, we see a fisherman on the beach, and we can see that he's getting a bite. So it's kind of a silly pun. But again, nature, the clouds are very threatening. Notice how close they are to the ground. They're much closer than they would actually be in nature. But it's sort of expressing how those clouds can really be kind of oppressive. I mean, that's what I'm painting is a place where I actually like to fish. And when a storm comes in, it does seem kind of oppressive. And it does sort of chase me back to my car. And I have to go running through that tall grass. So this painting is meant to be an expression of an experience that I have as a human being, capturing the experience that I have rather than trying to mimic what a camera might record if it was recording the same scene. And it couldn't record this scene exactly the way I've painted it, because this isn't exactly accurately representing nature in a photographic sense. It's capturing the human experience. And here this is a painting by Magritte, an oil painting. And notice how he's using those figures to create a sense of space. The figures that are up close are much darker, and there's more contrast. And then they get bluer, they get grayer the farther away they get. And that helps to create this illusion of space in this very dreamlike painting. And here, this is one of my dreamlike paintings called Storming In, and I'm using that same technique to create a sense of space. The clouds are much warmer, they're much larger, more contrasty up close, and they get bluer, they get grayer as they go back. Same thing with the sailboats. The sailboat up close is a lot more contrast, it's a lot warmer, and then they get bluer. The sailboats get smaller and bluer as they go back. Same thing with the waves. But notice that I'm capturing the experience of being on stormy seas rather than actually the photographic accuracy of it. Now, I've been out on the Chesapeake Bay in stormy weather, and a photograph of it wouldn't capture it the way this does. I mean, here the boat really looks like it's being tossed around. But those waves are a little too similar by comparison with actual waves, but they do sort of have a threatening look. Notice how they seem like almost like fingers that are reaching up trying to grab that boat. And the clouds do have a little bit of that quality too. But here I'm trying to capture the experience of being in threatening weather in a boat rather than the actual photographic accuracy of it. I'm trying to capture an experience that I have with my whole body, which I have with my perception, which I perceive with my mind, and which I'm recreating with my mind because I'm not actually looking at a subject. I'm doing this from my imagination, and I'm relying on my perception. I'm relying on my memory, my experience of this to create this image, which attempts to capture the essence of how it feels rather than how it looks. Now here, this is Vincent van Gogh, and he's trying to capture the essence of his experience. And he sees the sky as, swirling and windy, and notice how he's using brush strokes and lining up those brush strokes to create this swirling sky and cloud appearance, which captures his way of seeing the landscape. We are all individuals. We all experience these things in different ways. And so here he's able to express his individuality. And that's another reason why we make paintings, because we want to express the way we see things as individuals. And we can see by looking at all of these different artists and even the photographers that we all experience nature in a slightly different way. And we're trying to create a sense of our individuality in the way that we capture these landscapes. And here that's what Vincent van Gogh is doing. He's expressing his individuality by saying, this is how I see it. Not, this is how actually not the way I see it, but this is how I perceive it, how I experience it in my mind. And this is one of my paintings. Again, this is an egg tempera painting. It's smallish. It's 12 by 9 inches. It's called Stormy. And, we have the storm clouds moving in over this landscape. The ground, the landscape itself, the earth, the civilization is very regular, very safe looking, very similar. And the clouds are much more organic, much more threatening by comparison. And so there is a contrast between the clouds, the stormy clouds, and that more safe, regular, civilized earth below the clouds. And notice the people are all sort of running for safety. And so here we have, again, my way of perceiving nature, my way of seeing this experience, this moment in people's lives when storms come in and when they seem to threaten us. And, and that's not just seeing, nature that way, but it's also sort of like a metaphor for the events in our own lives where we experience sort of stormy moments in our lives, threatening moments in our lives, which seem so similar to the way that nature can threaten us with its cloudy, stormy, lightning, thundering presence. So thank you for listening to me talk to you today about the difference between the way machines see the world and the way we perceive it as human beings, especially with the way that we are able to express that through our paintings and our photographs of clouds. So thanks again for watching this video.